The first time Diane Prescott ever spoke to me, she didn't even get out of her car. She rolled down the window of her white Range Rover, clipboard resting on the door, and said, "This land isn't a farm anymore, Mr. Kessler. It's a liability with cherry trees on it." That was March. By October, Hollow Creek Estates, HOA, had foreclosed on 60 acres my family had farmed since 1911. They sold it at auction for $84,000. $84,000 for land appraised at $4.1 million. Diane already had a buyer lined up. 14 luxury lots, $3.6 million on the table, and her name quietly written into the developer's side letter for a cut of the difference. By the end, Diane Prescott would lose her house, her title, her freedom, and every cent of that $3.6 million. But the number that mattered most was still that first one, $84,000. Because that was the price she paid for land that was about to own her right back. She thought she was foreclosing on a tired old man with dirt under his nails. She had no idea what was sitting in my name at a regional bank 2 counties over. Nobody did. Not yet. My name is Walter Kessler. I'm 63 years old. And this is the story of how a homeowners association stole my grandfather's orchard and how I bought the mortgage on every single house in that neighborhood, including hers. My grandfather, Otto Kessler, planted the first cherry trees on that land in 1911. He'd come out from a dust farm in Fredericksburg with nothing but a wagon, 2 mules, and a wife who believed in him more than the soil did. He built our farmhouse table by hand that same year, out of black walnut, and every Kessler who ever sat at it, 4 generations of us, left a scratch or a burn mark or a coffee ring that never came out. My father was born in the back bedroom. My mother died in the front one. 3 generations of Kesslers are buried under the old pecan tree at the edge of the orchard, and every May the whole property smells like cherry blossoms and diesel from the tractor, and every October it smells like fruit going soft in the heat, sweet and a little rotten, the smell of a harvest that never once in 113 years failed to come in. I never told anybody in Hollow Creek Estates what I actually did for a living before I came home to run that orchard full-time. They saw an old man in a faded ball cap driving a truck with a cracked windshield, and they made their assumptions. Diane Prescott made hers louder than anyone. Diane was 54, president of the HOA board for 6 years running, and she drove that Range Rover like it owed her money. Tailored blazers, a clipboard she carried like a weapon, a smile she only used right before she said something cruel. She'd built her reputation on protecting property values, which mostly meant fining widows for wind chimes and threatening liens on anybody who didn't repaint their shutters the approved shade of grey. What nobody knew, what I made sure nobody knew, was that 14 years earlier I'd walked away from farming to run a small investment fund out of Austin. Water rights, distressed agricultural debt, regional banks nobody else wanted. I came home when my father got sick, and I never advertised what I still owned on paper. Diane Prescott saw an old farmer to push around. She never once asked what a man does with 40 years of quiet money. It started on a Tuesday, 2:47 p.m. I remember the exact time because I was standing in the south block checking irrigation lines when a county truck rolled up the gravel drive and a man in a windbreaker taped an orange notice to my gatepost like he was hanging a Christmas wreath. Notice of assessment lien, Hollow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Amount owed, $46,200. I'd never received a single piece of mail from that HOA in 11 years of ownership. My orchard wasn't even inside their platted boundary. Otto had sold off the surrounding acreage to developers back in the 80s, and Hollow Creek Estates grew up around my land like weeds around a fence post. But there it was, my parcel number, my name, $46,000 in violations I'd never been notified of. Overgrown vegetation, unauthorized agricultural structures, failure to maintain common area drainage. I didn't yell, I didn't call anybody. I took a photograph of that notice with a timestamp, and then I drove into town and sent myself a copy by certified mail, return receipt requested, so I'd have a federal postmark proving exactly when I first saw it. 40 years in finance teaches you one thing above everything else. The man who keeps better records wins. 2 weeks later, Diane showed up in person, clipboard in hand, to tell me the board had no choice but to move forward with a forced sale. I stood in my own driveway, boots in the gravel, and asked her a simple question. Diane, my property was never part of your association. Show me the covenant with my signature on it. She smiled that smile. Your grandfather's parcel was voluntarily annexed in 1987, Mr. Kessler. It's all on file. I said nothing. I just took her photograph too, time-stamped, dated, her standing in front of that Range Rover with the clipboard tucked under her arm like a shield. I had a feeling I was going to need it. Here's what most homeowners don't know. Under Texas Property Code Section 209, an HOA cannot foreclose on assessment liens without strict notice requirements, certified mail, a specific cure period, an itemized statement of the debt. Diane's board had skipped almost all of it. But I didn't say a word about that yet. I wanted to see how far she'd go first. I hired a title researcher out of San Antonio, a sharp woman named Priya Anand, who owed me a favor from an old fund deal. 3 days later, she called me with the first piece of good news I'd had in a month. Walter, she said, your grandfather never signed an annexation agreement. There's no covenant, no signature, nothing. The 1987 filing they're citing is a blank template. Whatever fines they levied against you are legally void. That was my small shield. Worthless fines, no binding covenant. I could have stopped there, gotten an injunction, gone home satisfied. But Priya wasn't finished. There's something else, she said. I pulled the HOA's foreclosure filings for the last 3 years. Yours isn't the first. There are 2 other properties sold at auction under nearly identical circumstances, undocumented liens, no proper notice. Both bought back by a company called Prescott Land Holdings, LLC. I sat with that for a long moment, the smell of cut grass drifting through my truck window, cicadas going off somewhere in the mesquite. Prescott, same name as the woman with the clipboard. That's when I met Ruth Holman. Ruth was 78, a widow, her husband a Vietnam veteran who'd passed 6 years back. She lived 2 lots down from where my orchard used to touch the development line, on oxygen for her lungs, a flag on her porch that hadn't been taken down since the funeral. The HOA had fined her $4,000 for unauthorized medical equipment storage, her oxygen concentrator sitting in her own garage. She showed me the letter with hands that shook. Not from fear, from the tremor she'd had since her stroke. They said if I don't pay, they'll put a lien on the house, she told me. This house is all I have left of him, Mr. Kessler. I looked at that letter, then at my own orange notice still sitting on my kitchen table, and I understood, finally, that this wasn't really about cherry trees, or drainage easements, or oxygen tanks. Diane Prescott wasn't protecting property values, she was running a machine. And Ruth Holman and I were just 2 more names it was grinding through. I made one phone call that afternoon to a man named Gerald Voss, who ran the acquisitions desk at the investment fund I still quietly controlled. I told him I wanted the full file on a regional bank 2 counties over, First Trust of Hollow Creek, the same bank holding the mortgage notes on every house in Diane Prescott's development. Walter, Gerald said. That bank's been for sale for 8 months. Nobody wants it. Bad loan book. Thin margins. Good, I said. I want it anyway, quietly. And Gerald, I want every note tied to Hollow Creek Estates pulled and reviewed before we close. He was quiet for a second. Then he laughed, low, like he already knew where this was going. You're not just trying to save an orchard anymore, are you? I looked out my kitchen window at the pecan tree, at 3 generations of Kesslers resting under it, and at the empty stretch of dirt where the bulldozers were already parked, waiting for a judge's signature. No, I said, I'm not. The lien notice on Ruth Holman's house came due on a Friday, $4,000, and when she couldn't pay it in 14 days, the letter said, the HOA would pursue all available remedies, which was legal language for taking her home the same way they'd taken my orchard. I drove out that same afternoon and mounted a trail camera in the crook of the old pecan tree, the one shading 3 generations of Kesslers. I told myself it was for the deer that kept getting into what was left of the harvest. That wasn't the whole truth. Priya's title research had turned up a temporary restraining order I'd filed the week before, blocking any physical alteration to the orchard parcel pending the fraud investigation. If Diane Prescott was going to violate a judge's order, I wanted it in high definition. 10 days later, at 2:47 p.m., the same time, near enough, that first notice had gone up on my gatepost, the camera caught her. She came in a white pickup behind 2 men from Halberd Development, the same outfit lined up to build those 14 luxury lots. I wasn't home. I was at the courthouse filing papers with Priya, but the footage showed Diane Prescott standing in the shade of that pecan tree, clipboard against her hip, pointing at the trunk, while one of the men fired up a chainsaw. "Take it down," she said, loud enough the camera's microphone caught every word. No orchard, no dispute. Let his lawyer argue about a stump. She didn't know what was buried under that tree. She didn't ask. The saw bit into bark that had been growing since before her parents were born, and by the time I got the call from a neighbor and raced back down the gravel drive, the trunk was already leaning, already screaming that low groaning crack a tree makes right before it goes. I didn't run at her. I didn't shout. I stood at the edge of my own land and I filmed it myself, on my phone, right alongside the trail camera still rolling in the branches above. Diane saw me. She smiled, that same smile, clipboard tucked under her arm. "Should have signed the covenant, Mr. Kessler," she said. I said nothing. 40 years in finance teaches you that the man who stays quiet and keeps the tape rolling always wins the case that matters. That night, I sat at my grandfather's walnut table with Ruth Hallman across from me, an oxygen line running to her nose, and I told her what I'd found. The temporary restraining order, the criminal mischief, Texas Penal Code Section 28.03, destruction of property, enhanced because it violated an active court order. I told her about Prescott Land Holdings LLC, about the second and third properties Priya had traced back to sham foreclosures, about a bank 2 counties over that nobody wanted to buy. "Ruth," I said, "in 9 days I'm calling a special session of that board. I need you there, not to speak, just to sit in the front row." She looked at me a long moment, oxygen machine humming soft in the kitchen behind her, and she said, "You're not a farmer, are you, Walter?" "Not entirely," I said. She almost smiled. "Good. I hope you're something worse for people like her." I spent those 9 days doing what men like me do best. Paperwork nobody sees until it's too late to stop. Gerald closed the acquisition of First Trust of Hollow Creek on a Wednesday, quiet as a held breath. My fund became majority owner of the very bank holding the mortgage notes on every house in Hollow Creek Estates, including a 91-day delinquent note on a property titled to Prescott Land Holdings LLC. I filed the trail camera footage with the county sheriff and requested a deputy attend the board's next public session, framed as routine oversight of an assessment dispute. I invited a reporter from the county paper who'd been circling the story since my orchard's auction made the local news. Everyone I invited thought they were coming to watch an old farmer lose again. Tuesday, 2:47 p.m. The Hollow Creek Estates clubhouse smelled like burnt coffee and new carpet glue. Diane Prescott sat at the head of the board table in a cream blazer, clipboard in front of her like always, a Halberd Development representative at her right hand. Ruth Hallman sat in the front row, oxygen tank at her feet. A sheriff's deputy stood near the door. A reporter had her notebook open. "This session," Diane began, "is to finalize the parcel transfer for—" "Before you do that," I said, standing, "I'd like the board to see something." I set a folder on the table. Inside were 14 mortgage notes, each one bearing the seal of First Trust of Hollow Creek, each one tied to a home inside that development, including Diane Prescott's own colonial on Magnolia Court, 91 days past due since she'd quietly funneled her salary into a shell account tied to the Halberd deal. My fund closed on First Trust 3 weeks ago, I said. I'm the majority owner, which means I hold every note in this room, including yours, Diane. The room went the kind of silent that has a sound to it, chairs creaking, someone's pen stopping mid-stroke. Diane's face didn't move for a second, like she was waiting for the punchline. Then I nodded to the deputy, and he stepped forward with the trail camera footage cued on a tablet. Diane, clipboard on her hip, ordering a chainsaw into a 113-year-old tree standing over my family's graves, in direct violation of a signed restraining order. Diane Prescott, the deputy said, you're under arrest for criminal mischief and violation of a court order. The clipboard hit the carpet. Nobody in that room moved to pick it up. Diane Prescott was charged with criminal mischief under Texas Penal Code Section 28.03, violation of a court order, and securing execution of a document by deception under Section 32.46, tied to the falsified liens used to foreclose on my orchard and 2 other properties. The county's forensic audit found Prescott Land Holdings, LLC, had funneled $3.6 million in projected lot sales through a side agreement with Halberd Development, with Diane set to personally collect just under $900,000 once the 14 luxury lots closed. She pleaded no contest. The court ordered $84,000 restored to me immediately, the exact sum the orchard sold for at that fraudulent auction, plus $460,000 in damages and legal fees. Prescott Land Holdings, LLC, was dissolved, and its remaining assets seized. Halberd Development paid a civil settlement of $310,000 and withdrew from the county entirely. 2 other board members who'd signed off on the fake liens resigned and paid restitution to their own neighbors. Diane received 4 years probation, a permanent ban from serving on any homeowners association board in the state, and, because her own mortgage was delinquent on a bank I now controlled, foreclosure proceedings on her house at Magnolia Court filed the same week as her sentencing. The orchard came back to me whole, minus 1 pecan tree that never grew back. We planted a new one that spring, a sapling, right beside the old stump, close enough that its roots would someday tangle with what was left below. Ruth Hallman stood next to me at the planting, off oxygen for the first time in months, elected, unopposed, as the new president of Hollow Creek Estates, HOA. The first thing she did in office was waive every fraudulent assessment ever filed. I learned 3 things that year. Quiet money outlasts loud cruelty. Paper trails win what shouting never will. And the people who threaten your home rarely stop to ask what's already sitting in yours. Gerald called me 2 weeks later with a strange note in his voice. Walter, he said, Halberd Development's parent company just defaulted on 3 other developments. Guess whose fund holds the paper? I looked out at the new sapling, at the pecan shade it would cast in 40 years I likely wouldn't see, and I smiled the way my grandfather used to before harvest. Send me the file, I said. Gerald laughed on the other end of the line. That dry laugh he only used when he already knew I'd say yes. 3 developments, Walter. 2 of them border state parkland. You want the water rights review first or the title work? Both, I said, same as always. I hung up and stood on the porch a while, listening to the cicadas start their evening run in the mesquite. The same sound that had been playing under every hard conversation that whole year. Down the gravel drive, Ruth Hallman's porch light flicked on. She was out there most evenings now, no oxygen tank at her feet, just a lawn chair and a glass of tea, watching the orchard the way some people watch television. You planning on telling the rest of the neighborhood what you really are, Walter Kessler? She called out, not unkindly. Already did, I said, walking the fence line toward her. Told them I'm a farmer who got tired of paperwork. She snorted. You got tired of paperwork the way a shark gets tired of swimming. A few of the neighbors had started coming by that fall, folks I'd waved to for 11 years without ever really talking to. Frank Delgado from 2 streets over, whose fence line the old board had cited for unauthorized coloring. He brought a case of beer and just sat on my tailgate the first time, not saying much, just watching the new sapling like it was a scoreboard. Diane fined me $600 for a fence that's the same grey as everybody else's, he said eventually. You believe that? I believe it, I said. I've got the file. That got a laugh out of him, short and surprised, like he hadn't laughed about that HOA in years and forgot he still could. Marjorie Yun, who'd lived on the corner since the development broke ground, stopped me outside the feed store one Saturday and gripped my arm harder than I expected from a woman her size. You know what she told me when I asked for an extension on my assessment, Marjorie said. She said, "Rules don't bend for sad stories, Marjorie. I want you to know I stood in that clubhouse and watched them walk her out in cuffs, and it was the best afternoon I've had since my husband's retirement party." I didn't say much back, I never did, but I kept thinking, driving home past the empty lot where Diane's Range Rover used to sit polished in her driveway, about how much of this had never really been about cherry trees or clipboards or grey paint at all. It was about who got to decide whose home was disposable and whose was just business. For a long time in that neighborhood, Diane Prescott had been the one deciding. Now the file on my desk had 3 new development names in it. Water rights running through parkland, mortgage paper already thinning out under companies that didn't know yet what or who was about to come looking,